Coming up today on the Nick Craig Show, Republicans have a lot on the line in these midterm elections throughout the state of North Carolina. We'll get into all the details with Andrew Dunn from Longleaf Politics coming up. And a good Tuesday morning to you. Welcome into the Nick Craig Show, streaming live this morning on YouTube, Rumble, X, and Facebook. Don't forget that you can take the show with you 24/7 on demand by checking out the Nick Craig Show in your favorite podcast app. You can also listen online by visiting the website nickcraig.com. Our show this morning is brought to you by the Law Group here in Wilmington. Visit them online, lawgroupnc.com, or give them a call, 910-251-6088. We'll hear more from them as we continue through this Tuesday edition of the Nick Craig Show. We've spent a lot of time talking about midterm elections, and we will obviously continue to do that as we go through the remainder of this year. But I really want to hone in on North Carolina on the program today, because especially for individuals that are not longtime residents of this state, it is important to kind of walk through a little bit of the history as to how North Carolina is the way that it is right now, because it didn't happen by accident, and it's something that was not always the way that it is. And when we talk about North Carolina politics, it is very important to note that it was just about 15 or 20 years ago that North Carolina was in a far different position than it is right now. And this is something that I cannot underscore anymore. It needs to continue to be relayed and highlighted that if Republicans in North Carolina do not show up in these midterm elections that are going to be taking place in November. Early voting will start in mid-October for those elections, which, yes, it's still here early March, but it's going to be here before you know it. You'll blink and we'll be through the summer, and Labor Day will be here, and it won't be long until we're talking about these elections. And it is very important to understand where we were as a state. Prior to 2011, the state of North Carolina was dealing with 100 plus years of Democrat control. This was a state that had some of the highest taxes anywhere in the Southeast. It was a state that was consistently running somewhat of a budget deficit. It was the 2008 financial crisis, which, yes, outsized factors, not necessarily the responsibility of North Carolina, not necessarily North Carolina's fault, that had this state in an miserable financial position, a miserable spot for the state, where we owed a whole bunch of money. We had a whole bunch of debt owed to the federal government. The state was practically broke. The budget was topped out. There was no extra money, no rainy day fund, no reserves, none of that available. Teachers were being furloughed. State employees were being furloughed by, at the time, Governor Bev Perdue, due to the fact that, again, the state was just out of money, and you had that financial crisis of 2008, which affected the entire nation. Since that period of time, things have changed dramatically. And you've heard me, some of you have heard me say this before. This stuff doesn't happen by accident. Over the last 4 years, 3 of those years, North Carolina has been ranked the #1 state for business, according to CNBC. That is not something that just magically happens. That is not something that you just roll out of bed and, wow, magically, you're the #1 state for business. No, that is something that only can happen when you have strong leadership, strong individuals leading the charge in North Carolina. And myself, as a transplant to this state, and I probably shouldn't announce that publicly, but like many of you, a transplant to this state, we don't necessarily have all of that background, all of that history. And I've taken it upon myself, as long as I've been involved in North Carolina politics, to understand some of this backstory, to understand truly where this state was not that long ago. Folks, we're not talking about 50 or 60 years ago. We're talking about 15, 20 years ago. That's where North Carolina was. a tax climate for not only businesses, but for residents of this state that was incredibly burdensome, that was incredibly restrictive, put a huge cost burden on the good people of this state. Why? So that Democrats that were in the governor's mansion and Democrats controlling the North Carolina General Assembly could spend every single dollar that they could squeeze out of you. And at the same time, not make smart financial decisions, not have a large rainy day fund, which thank God the state of North Carolina has now, right? We'll be approaching here in September the 2-year anniversary of Hurricane Helene. 2 years of unbelievable devastation in the western half of our state, killing more than 100 people, devastating city and town after city and town, counties ravaged in the western half of our state. Had North Carolina not had its rainy day fund, no pun intended with the name, available for those counties, those cities, those towns, those residents in western North Carolina, the situation out there would have been even worse. And it's hard to imagine a worse situation that already existed. It's pretty hard for me to close my eyes and imagine how much worse the situation could have been. Now, that doesn't mean that there's not still issues. There's still a lot of struggle and a lot of pain out in the western half of our state. I'm not attempting to minimize any of that at all, and I'm not even going to sit here and claim that state and federal lawmakers have handled it perfectly. They have not. But without that rainy day fund, without those extra dollars available, essentially in a savings account that were set aside by the North Carolina General Assembly, you can begin to picture what something like that looks like. And I will continue to repeat this same phrase over and over again as we go through the remainder of this year. This stuff is not an accident. You have to be very strategic. In this case, the who is lawmakers had to be very strategic over the last 15 or 20 years, really more 15 years, since 2011, since Republicans took the majority. They had to be very strategic to put North Carolina in this position. They had to make strategic cuts to personal income taxes, the corporate or business income tax rate here in North Carolina to entice business, to entice innovation, to entice companies in some cases to uproot themselves from other places across the country and decide they're going to make the Tar Heel State not only their home for the individuals that are leading those businesses, but for their employees as well. I will admit I've not been in a position where I've moved a large business across the country. I would imagine, though, just knowing enough that as I do about business, that's not an easy decision. To uproot a company and move it, in some cases, literally from coast to coast, California to North Carolina, that's not a decision you make lightly. There's a lot that goes into said decision. And for companies to be willing to do that, for other firms to make major multi-$100 million, billion-dollar investments here in North Carolina, that is something that we need to make sure that as conservatives, as Republicans, we understand and we promulgate that message out to our friends, our family, individuals when we're getting into discussions over what is going to be a very heated primary cycle. One that I will note has the ability for North Carolina, the North Carolina legislature to flip, where you've got a current Republican majority in the House. There is a possibility. Now, I don't know exactly what the odds are. It's probably less than 50-50, but it could easily be 60-40, maybe 70-30, that Democrats flip the North Carolina House. There is a real possibility that we are doing a show here in early November, our big election recap program, and we'll be talking about the fact that the North Carolina General Assembly, at least one chamber of the General Assembly, no longer has Republican control, which will be the first time in 15 years that has been the case. That is something that we cannot take lightly, and we should not take lightly by any stretch of the imagination. as I was just mentioning and bringing up and talking about, this stuff does not happen by accident. You don't have to go that far back in our history to see what was a very different North Carolina. And fortunately, under the leadership of individuals who, in some cases, have fallen out of popularity with the Republican Party here in North Carolina, Tom Tillis and Phil Berger really were the architects of this. Tom Tillis then, of course, parlayed that transition into becoming a United States Senator. He served 2 terms there, announced that he was not running for re-election last year. He has fallen out of favor with Republicans in North Carolina for good reason, due to some of the things that he has said, some of the actions that he has taken in Washington, D.C. He is the chief architect behind this. Phil Berger, we are keeping a very close eye as we go through the remainder of this week to see what the county canvass process looks like. On Friday, it would appear, at least as of right now, that Phil Berger will lose his primary election to Rockingham County Sheriff Sam Page, meaning that, yes, he will serve the remainder of his term here in 2026, but will not be back in the North Carolina General Assembly as we flip the calendar over to 2027. Those 2 chief architects are no longer going to be involved in the political space. And we'll talk to Andrew Dunn about this from Longleaf Politics, because I've got a couple of questions for him as it relates to individuals, specifically dealing with Senate Leader Phil Berger. Is that inherently a bad thing? No. And I'll ask Andrew Dunn about that, because change is inherently good. And so what I want to make sure that we understand is that there's different kinds of change. Now, you might be talking to some individuals that maybe are in the middle of the road, maybe lean a little bit more left, and they would say to you, maybe, well, Republicans have controlled the state for 15 years. It's time that Democrats get a crack at it. I think that's a terrible idea. We have seen in other state legislatures across the country over the last 15 years what Democrat leadership looks like. I mean, look at what's going on in Virginia right now. They just had their municipal elections not more than 5 months ago, and you are already seeing the new governor in Abigail Spanberger and the Democrat-led Virginia legislature completely gutting that state, bringing forth some of the most progressive policies that you can even begin to wrap your head around. Right? That is a very real thing. That is happening literally right in our backyard, just to the north in Virginia. It's happening right on North Carolina's border. Governor Stein is not up for re-election this year. Governors and Council of State members serve 4-year terms, so he is not going to be on the ballot. A Democrat will remain in the governor's mansion. Can you imagine a situation where Democrats take control of the North Carolina House? Yes, I can, because there's a very real possibility of it. And what will that mean? That it will be the North Carolina Senate, which is a much smaller governing body, not too dissimilar from what you see between the House and Senate up in Washington, D.C., that you have got the Senate as the last holdout for North Carolina. And if this situation comes to fruition, hopefully it does not, you will see complete and total stagnation here in North Carolina. You will get no legislation passed with a split legislature. With a Democrat majority in the House, a Senate or a Republican majority in the Senate, nothing will be done. And in anything that can get done, if Republicans are able to convince a couple of Democrats to work across the aisle, it's going to, of course, be vetoed by Governor Josh Stein. And if that's the case, there's no path for a veto override, which is incredibly tough right now. I get a couple of posts on X almost every week of people asking me about the current veto overrides. When are those going to be dealt with? And my answer remains the same. They're not scheduled right now, and I don't know that they ever will be, due to the fact that some of the members in the North Carolina General Assembly have no interest in moving forward with some of this stuff. Great comment coming in on the show. Easy to see it flip. They can't get a budget done. That's a major problem for lawmakers. They do have the majority in the House and the Senate, and they can't get a budget done. Governor Josh Stein holding a press conference yesterday, holding a major press conference calling on nearly $1.4 million for what he calls, quote, critical needs budget, calling on the North Carolina General Assembly, the Republican-led legislature, to get their act together and get a budget passed. And now, while fortunately here in North Carolina, we have provisions in our general statute that does not shut down like we're seeing, like we talked about yesterday with the DHS shutdown and TSA and all of those issues, there is a problem when you ask individuals what are their thoughts on a budget, and they say, well, they find it very frustrating that lawmakers can't get together on a budget and can't get this happen. And, this was an interesting question going back to the Carolina Journal poll that was published right before the primary election. This was 600 likely Republican voters. So these would be individuals that you would presume would be in favor of the Republican-led General Assembly. Take a look at this question. Do you approve or disapprove of how the state legislature handled the recent tax and budget negotiations? Only 23.4% of likely Republican primary voters said they approve. Less than 4% strongly approved, 19% somewhat approved, and the overwhelming majority was 36% said that they disapproved of the work that the legislature was doing. These are Republican primary voters. These are your one percenters, you and me, those that are listening to this program. You and I, we are the ones that just showed up last week to vote. We are the ones that answered these poll questions. I mean, I didn't, maybe you didn't either, but we fall into this group. We fall into this category. And 36% of these voters say they disapprove. Now, these are Republicans. Can you imagine what Democrats think about this? It's got to be like probably 90+% say that they disapprove of this work because nothing's been done. There's been this heated debate between state lawmakers over what to do with taxes in the state of North Carolina, and that has what has had this budget backlog going on now, going back to almost a year ago, right? The budget was supposed to be passed July the 1st. That was the start of the fiscal year here in North Carolina. It didn't happen. There has been some mini budgets. We'll likely see some additional mini budgets in the days and weeks to come, potentially, as lawmakers make their way back to Raleigh here, hopefully in the next couple of weeks. But that's the situation that we're facing right now. This stuff is not a given. It is not a guarantee that Republicans maintain a majority in the North Carolina legislature. We are just one election away from that not being the case. Our state lawmakers are elected every 2 years, meaning that in the snap of a finger, you can go from having a majority to being in the minority. And a midterm election with Republicans in Washington, D.C. is a prime opportunity for Democrats here in 2026. And so I will encourage each and every one of you. You have got to get involved in this process if you want to continue to see the prosperity that exists currently in North Carolina. If you sit on the sidelines, if you're sitting on your couch posting in a Facebook group, North Carolina conservatives, or you're running around the state proclaiming to be some sort of grassroots expert, if you are not driving voter activity as we head deeper and deeper into 2026, if you are not actively campaigning for state lawmakers and trying to help them get either reelected or elected for the first time, you are going to potentially be facing a very bad situation coming up later this year. I'm not saying this to scare anybody. I'm not trying to be a panicking or a doomer. I don't typically subscribe to those ideas. Just not in favor of doing that. It's not really the situation in which I thrive, but it's a very real thing, folks. It is. You are staring down the barrel at the North Carolina House, flipping from Republican control to Democrat control for the first time in 15 years. And you can guarantee what that will look like in North Carolina. As I was just talking about, take a look at Virginia. Take a look at what Abigail Spanberger, to her credit, did very well. And there's some great comments coming in on this. Spanberger was bait and switch on moderation. She's a radical. My bet is that she runs for president. She did a very good job at proclaiming to be this moderate Democrat. And we saw literally within, 24 hours of her winning her election and being sworn in, that she proposed one of the most progressive sets of policies and laws in modern history in the state of Virginia. You're going to see the same thing with Roy Cooper. He is and already has been proclaiming himself as some sort of winner of the middle, some sort of moderate charlatan. It's not the case. Roy Cooper is a radical, out of control progressive. Don't believe me? Go look at his actions as governor. Don't take my word for it. Don't take his word for it. Look at what he did. Look at the battles that he fought with the Republican-led General Assembly on what most people would consider common sense legislation, holding criminals accountable, right? Such a simple issue. Yet Roy Cooper and the vast majority of the Democrat Party not only were, but remain on the wrong side of an issue like that. That's what Republicans are up against later this year. We haven't even really talked about the Senate race. I'm not going to get into that today. We'll have plenty of time to do that moving forward. But these are the very real things that we can be staring down the barrel at here in North Carolina. Another comment coming in. I see Spanberger being the way to get more radicals in. It's been going on for years, but now in our face and they're laughing at us. Yeah, that's absolutely the case. And it's a very effective strategy. The Democrats, to their credit, as much as I hate giving the devil his due, I've got to give them credit. They have seemingly, at least in some areas of the country, it doesn't work everywhere, but in some areas of the country, have done a very good job at reframing themselves or reportraying themselves as moderate, middle-of-the-road candidates, when in all reality, they are radical, out-of-control leftists. And so that is a major, major problem that Republicans, conservatives, whatever label, everybody, of course, in the GOP has to give themselves some sort of clarifying label. We just can't get behind Republicans. You've got to self-describe yourself as, oh, I'm a grassroots this, I'm an activist that. At the end of the day, we're all on the, or at least I believe we are, all on the same side of these issues, or at least 80 or 90% of them. And I can promise you that if there is a significant amount of infighting within the Republican Party as we continue through this year, if individuals whose primary candidates did not win decide that they're going to take their ball and go home and not participate in this process, we are going to get our asses handed to us later this year. I will promise you that will be the case. And it's going to start at the top of the ticket, because the relevance of the Senate election is not only Roy Cooper versus Michael Whatley, it's going to be the turnout that those candidates are able to garner. Whether you like it or not, Roy Cooper is a very popular figure here in North Carolina. He has 100% name identification, and individuals really like him across the aisle, across party lines. He is going to drive an incredible amount of Democrat turnout. And so for Republicans that don't feel that every single candidate is conservative enough for them, that are going to decide to sit home in November, that are going to decide it is in their best interest to spend the next 6 months lobbing stones and rocks and shooting bows and arrows at the current Republicans that are either elected or running for re-election, you are going to cost this state for Republicans. That is the situation that you are creating. Nobody else will be creating that except for you. Now, that does not mean that you shouldn't be critical. That does not mean that you can't have strong opinions, strong thoughts, strong ideas, maybe that might be contrary to a candidate. Diversity of thought is good. Unlike those on the political left, most of us actually believe in diversity in our own party. At least I do. I love ideas. I love different thoughts. I love being challenged on the things that I believe. There's a difference, however, and we talked about this, late last week on the show about negativity. There's a difference between being critical and actively sabotaging your own party. And I'm telling you what, I'm going to call out these saboteurs as we go through the year. These individuals that are going to make it their business to tear down the Republican Party from the inside, to tear down Republican candidates as we go into these midterm elections, I'm not going to put up with it. Those individuals are going to be called out. I'll invite them on here to make their point if they're willing to do so. I'm sure most won't. But they need to be called out. They need to be put in their place on this stuff. Just because you don't agree with somebody 100% of the time does not mean that a Democrat is a better alternative. And so that is my kind of preface, my warning to you as we go through the remainder of this year. And obviously things will slow down a little bit in the summer months. That's just typical here across North Carolina. But we'll continue to keep an eye on all of this stuff and make sure that you've got all of the pertinent, useful information that you need to not only make an informed decision yourself, but to try and convince other individuals to get out later this year in those midterm elections here across the state. We'll continue the discussion right here on the Nick Craig Show. I want to thank the Law Group here in Wilmington for their continued support and remind you that when legal challenges arise, make sure you trust Melissa Gott and her team. Since 2003, their experienced attorneys have provided high-quality, affordable legal services across the eastern half of our state. Whether you're facing a divorce, navigating a real estate transaction, or maybe you're in a position where you need a strong criminal defense. If so, the Law Group has your back. Their dedicated team ensures that your questions are answered and issues are resolved as quickly as possible. Great news, folks. They're located in downtown Wilmington and just a phone call away at 910-251-6088, or you can visit them online at lawgroupnc.com. Give them a call, 910-251-6088, or online at lawgroupnc.com. It's the Law Group. Experience and dedication you can rely on. We appreciate the Law Group and their continued support of the Nick Craig Show. All right, quick break. On the other side, we will catch up with Andrew Dunn from Longleaf Politics, a busy 7 days in North Carolina as primary results still are unofficial and will remain unofficial until Friday. We'll continue the conversation with him coming up as the Nick Craig Show continues, streaming live this morning, 7 a.m., YouTube, Rumble, X, Facebook, and available 24/7 wherever you get your podcasts. It has been a wild 7 days in North Carolina politics as primaries took place last week here across the Tar Heel State. We've been watching a lot, getting a lot of reaction from across North Carolina. To dive into some additional details on what he saw last week, it's my pleasure to welcome Andrew Dunn from Longleaf Politics to the Nick Craig Show. Andrew, thanks for the time. I guess we probably need to start off with what has generated the most buzz over the last week, which is North Carolina's 26th congressional district up on the Virginia border, Rockingham, northern portions of Guilford County. Would appear, at least as of right now, we'll watch the county canvass process take place on Friday, but it would appear right now that Sam Page, with his 23-vote lead, is in a pretty decent spot.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. The provisional ballot counting that happened on Friday was kind of the one real opportunity for the votes to switch. There was a handful, less than 100 votes outstanding in the provisional process, but with a 2-vote margin after Election Day, it really could have gone either way. So now that those votes have been counted and Page is still ahead, it seems highly likely that he's going to end up declared the victor here. There are a few votes that may still be counted, especially ones coming from overseas, but in a district race like this, you can't expect more than, just a handful of those.
Well, and I'm glad you bring that up because we've seen close statewide elections before. You go back to the Paul Newby race back a couple of years ago. However, Andrew, that was a statewide race with millions of ballots cast. When you look at this race, you're only looking at about 26,000 votes across all of Rockingham and northern Guilford. And while, yes, that's a large sum of people, when you're talking about trying to make up not only 23 votes, but assuming Page gets no more, that's a really tough margin here for Berger to deal with.
Exactly. And the Newbie race, that was a general election. This is a primary. So that cuts down the potential number of outstanding votes even more. I mean, I would be shocked if there are even 23 votes left outstanding, and that's setting aside how they would split.
Where do we go from here? Senate Leader Phil Berger has been in the North Carolina General Assembly going all the way back to the year 2000. He's been the leader of the North Carolina Senate since 2011. Many, Andrew, including myself, would argue he's the most powerful and influential man in North Carolina politics. How does North Carolina move forward? More particularly, how does the Republican majority move forward after what we could see later this week and into early next week?
Yeah, I mean, that's a huge open question. And the answer I'll give you will assume that the results hold and Sam Page ends up winning the primary, which of course is not a done deal even after this week. There could potentially be legal challenges. There could be some voters or some votes that are challenged. You may recall from some of those earlier races you were talking about that after the fact, both legal teams were going through the obituaries to see if any voters had died between casting an early vote and Election Day, because under North Carolina law, those votes do not count. Again, this is such a small pool of voters that I don't think that will be determinative, but that process could still play out. Now, say Phil Berger does lose the election. It's an open question what happens after that. It will create a huge power vacuum in North Carolina politics. There's a very real possibility that a new Senate leader comes to the forefront. I've seen some names floated, like Mike Lee down on the coast where you are. I've seen some, what are some other names? Todd
Ralph
Johnson,
Heiss.
I've seen Ralph Heiss. He would be a really good pick, I think. So, there is a chance that kind of the continuity is there and nothing really changes. However, there could be just a gaping hole that either Destin Hall over on the House side seeks to fill, or potentially Governor Josh Stein could try to step in and take on a lot more of that leadership. On Monday, Josh Stein put out a budget proposal for critical needs. So it seems like he's trying to at least get the ball rolling on some of that leadership that might normally be taken on by the House Speaker or the Senate President.
Now, it is important to note, and we'll, of course, keep a close eye on a potential recount and some legal challenges, as you just noted, Andrew, but Phil Berger will stay in this position up until either late December of this year or early January of next. I don't exactly remember when swearing in takes place for new members of the General Assembly. So he's got almost a full year left to remain serving his term. The folks in Rockingham County, based on the amount of money that was spent on the race and what the vote totals look like right now, they seemingly were very unhappy with Phil Berger and his leadership. But I do beg the question, Andrew, Phil Berger, as powerful as he was, as influential as he was, are the people in Rockingham and northern Guilford County going to be better off with a freshman lawmaker in Raleigh versus somebody who's been there for 26 years?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that was one of the key questions that voters had in their mind, I would imagine. I think it's safe to say that there's virtually zero chance that Sam Page will be as effective or powerful a lawmaker as Phil Berger was. However, Sam Page staked his whole campaign on being close to the people, being a representative of the people, and working for the people. So, um, you could argue whether or not that's a better thing for Rockingham County or a worse thing for Rockingham County, but it seems pretty clear that at least the voters in this primary felt like they would rather roll the dice.
Yeah, and they have seemingly have rolled the dice at this point. We'll keep a close eye on this race. Andrew, this was not the only race, however, in the primaries in which an incumbent, sometimes long-serving incumbents, like we were just talking about with Senate Leader Phil Berger, lost, in many cases, to political newcomers. We saw a couple of these races, Keith Kidwell, Representative Kelly Hastings, all of them losing their races to relatively new political newcomers. What do you make of that?
It really is nothing short of a political earthquake, even setting aside the Berger Page race. I mean, that Berger would be the ninth incumbent to lose. Already we know that 8 incumbents have lost their seats, which is a number that you don't normally see. The last time we had a number similar to that was 2018, but that was kind of a weird circumstance because the General Assembly lines had just been redrawn before that under court order, which meant that some of the new districts had incumbents double bucked. So obviously, in that case, an incumbent is going to go down. So this was just a normal old election cycle, and still we saw these number of incumbents lose. On the Democratic side, the story is kind of straightforward. It was 3 Democrats who had voted one time each, I believe, to override Governor Josh Stein's vetoes. And Stein actually did weigh in on a couple of those races and endorse the challenger, and all 3 of them lost their seats. On the Republican side, it's a little bit less clear. There's not one single storyline. But you mentioned Representative Hastings, and I think he's a great example of some of what we've seen. He lost to a political newcomer, Caroline Eason. She's in her mid-20s, a pharmacist from Lawndale. I'll be frank, I had not heard her name before election night, but she ran a real grassroots, on-the-ground, small-town campaign. It's really similar to what we saw 2 years ago with Wyatt Gable, who similarly unseated a long-term incumbent just by virtue of putting in the work.
Yeah, and I mean those are the two, and I'm glad you brought up Wyatt Gable and the work that he's been doing out in eastern North Carolina. It was very fascinating to see him in this General Assembly long session. But Andrew, when he won his election, he was still an active student at ECU running for the North Carolina General Assembly, winning that race, and is now seemingly serving his constituents pretty well in the North Carolina General Assembly. This younger generation of individuals kind of going up and slaying the dragon on some of these longtime serving General Assembly members is a fascinating thing to keep an eye on.
It really is. And I think in general, it's a good thing. Incumbency is always going to have some of its advantages. But what I'm seeing, at least, is that now that anyone can create an Instagram page, a Facebook page, a website with very little money, the tools of democracy have really been democratized, for lack of a better word. Anybody can get involved in the political process, but that's not the real reason why I think it's a good thing. The real reason is I think in America, our elected officials should have to earn the votes of their constituents every single election cycle. I don't think we should have a country or a state of North Carolina where incumbents are just going to cruise on through. I think it's a good thing to have honest debate and vigorous campaigns.
We were just talking about a couple of the Republican representatives. You highlighted some of the Democrats at the beginning. I think Carla Cunningham is probably one of the more interesting just because of the lopsided results. The last time I checked the unofficial results, Andrew, she lost something like 70 to 22%, which is a political bloodbath as an opponent. And as you noted, all of this because she spoke up in support of legislation being run through the North Carolina General Assembly, gave an very impassioned plea on the floor of the North Carolina House. Not only did Democrats go against her, but the governor himself, as you noted, actually campaigned for and endorsed her Democrat challenger opponent. And obviously, that was very successful.
Yeah, I mean that's an interesting dynamic there, and it really didn't make as many waves as I would have expected. I think back to Kirk Deviere when then Governor Roy Cooper launched the campaign against him. That got really personal and really fraught, and I just didn't see that. I'm here in Charlotte, and I didn't see too much acrimony on the ground. I think it was almost a foregone conclusion.
And I'm glad you brought up those previous examples because, to Roy Cooper and the Democrats' credit, the machine was chugging along very well, Andrew. It was very effective, a lot of influence and a lot of power. And it's only been a little more than a year now that Governor Josh Stein has been in office. He's been doing a lot around the state, and it would appear that his influence is seemingly just as strong as Roy Cooper's. Maybe you could argue even more just a year into his term.
Yeah, it seems like it. I mean, those two politicians, I mean, they're allies, but they are very, very different in their demeanor and how they work behind the scenes. It really does seem that current Governor Josh Stein wants to do things a little bit more diplomatically than his predecessor did. But as you point out, it's having the similar results. He's it looks like heading into the next 2 years of his term, he's going to have an easier time sustaining his veto, which gives him a ton more leverage.
Let me briefly ask you about that. We're still very far away from November. It's still here in early March. We're just a week removed from the primary, but all eyes, it's going to be a sprint now as we head through the summer and into the fall. How do you think things in North Carolina are going to shake up in the next, let's say, 6 or 7 months?
Yeah, it's a good question. And, the national attention is all going to be on the U.S. Senate race, and that is important. And we can talk about that if you'd like. But on the General Assembly side, all indications are that it will be a good year for Democrats, just by virtue of having a Republican president in the White House. Almost always, the political winds will be against the party in the White House. We saw something similar in 2018. I want to say it was somewhere between 6 and 10 seats in the state House of Representatives flipped from red to blue in 2018, and a smaller number in the Senate. I wouldn't expect the changes to be as dramatic in 2026, just by virtue of the lines have been drawn in such a way that there are fewer potentially swing districts. The House does have some vulnerable Republicans, especially in Wake County. Here in Mecklenburg County, we don't have any Republicans left, so there's nothing left to flip over here. I mean, that was one of the big reasons why 2018 was such a change, is because back then there still were Republicans in suburban Charlotte. Though they don't exist anymore, so those seats can't flip. Wake County Representative Mike Sheetzelt's in a tough race. Representative Aaron Perez always in a tough race. I think both of them have been really effective lawmakers, and they should be fine. But you never know heading into what could be a blue wave, and a lot's going to happen between now and November that could change things again.
Yeah, from a purely political math point, not too dissimilar from Washington, D.C., Democrats have a better opportunity of maybe even potentially flipping the North Carolina House. The likelihood of that in the Senate would be very odd, at least as of this point. It would have to be a banner year for Democrats. Not impossible, not beyond the realm of possibilities, but definitely far less likely. All right, let's go back to the top of the ticket. I wanted to end on this race, at least on the Republican side, between Michael Whatley and Don Brown. Andrew, I know, like me, you spend a lot of time on social media, and I'm sure you saw just as much as I did of the enthusiasm behind Don Brown. A lot of chatter on social media about him. Election night rolls around. He really didn't put up much of a contest at all. What do you make of that?
No, he didn't. And I've spoken with Don Brown on a number of occasions. He's a good person. I think he's done a lot of good things. However, I think it's just another example that the internet is not real life. And the only metric that really counts at the end of the day is your vote total. It doesn't matter what your retweets and likes and follower counts are. I can't say I was overly surprised. Michael Watley was extremely well funded. He had President Donald Trump's endorsement. I've seen some chatter that, the fact that Michael Watley, quote unquote, only got 65% of the vote was a sign of his weakness. And I don't think that's true. I think that that really discounts what Don Brown did. And he was extremely active all over the state campaigning. And like I said earlier, healthy competition is good for North Carolina.
The big question I think I've got right now is there was a lot of adamant Brown supporters on social media, and same thing with Watley's team. I did see a lot of the chatter before the election took place, Andrew, that no matter what happens, we are not voting for Michael Watley. We are not going to vote for him if he becomes our nominee. Well, that is now said and done. He won handedly on election night. Do you think that some of these, many who would describe themselves as grassroots organizers here in North Carolina, do you think they get on board with this and set their sights on Roy Cooper, who most of them presumably dislike more than you and I could even imagine?
I think that's the most likely thing to happen. I mean, emotions are always raw after a primary, and people will say a lot of things. Now, I do think that there probably are some folks who will just stay home. I don't see any of these people actually casting a ballot for Roy Cooper. But the turnout issue is an important one for Michael Watley. If he wants to win, he is going to have to turn out the base and as well as capture some of those swing voters. Right now by the polling, Roy Cooper does incredibly well with the quote unquote swing voters, independent voters, more so unaffiliated voters. As there are very few true independent swing voters out there. It really becomes a turnout game, and who's going to get folks excited and out to the polls.
Andrew, anything else that you took away from primary night that you're going to be keeping an eye on in the more immediate future outside of the Sam Page Phil Berger race over the next couple of months?
Oh gosh, well, I could have my plate full just taking stock of the Berger Page race. But the big race that I'm really going to start keying in on is the race for North Carolina Supreme Court. Justice Anita Earls is up for reelection. She won, I guess it was 8 years ago, in really kind of a fluke election. The General Assembly had changed all the rules as they were going from nonpartisan races back to partisan, in which in this case, there was not going to be, and there wasn't, a partisan primary, though the races on the general election ballot were partisan. So we ended up in November with 2 Republicans and 1 Democrat on the ballot. So obviously the Republicans split, and that put Anita Earls behind the bench. Obviously, that's not going to happen this time, but Anita Earls is going to have the very powerful liberal fundraising apparatus behind her, and we'll see what happens.
Andrew, tell us about some of the work that you do over at Longleaf Politics and the Charlotte Observer.
Yeah, I run Longleaf Politics. It's longleafpol.com, where I send out a weekly newsletter. I'm also writing a column for the McClatchy papers in North Carolina, Charlotte Observer and the Raleigh News and Observer.
Andrew, where can folks get tuned in with you? I know you're very active on social media and some other places. How do they do that?
Yeah, find me on X is probably the best place. It's at Andrew_Dunn, Dunn.
Andrew, thanks for the time this morning. Greatly appreciated.
Thank you.
Great insight as always from Andrew Dunn. Appreciate his time and willingness to join us on the program here this morning, laying out a couple of things that he is going to be watching in the months and weeks and ahead as we continue deeper down the path of 2026 and look towards those midterm elections. And I'll end the show where I started it this morning with this concept, this notion, this idea that if Republicans are not willing to get out later this year, if they are not willing to get behind Republican and conservative candidates, we risk the ability, the future of the economic prosperity that we have here in North Carolina, which we absolutely do, right? We have it. You can see it. Businesses are moving here. People are moving here. Yes, there are issues with people moving here. We know what some of the population boom can cause in some of our metro areas across the state. It's a big conversation here in Wilmington. It is not without issue. It is not without some level of pain and struggle and controversy while that's going on. but I will repeat a line that I find incredibly powerful. It is always better to be on the side of growth than on the side of decay or decline. And right now, North Carolina is on the side of growth. You can look at examples of states that are on the side of decline. You can look at California. You can look at New York. You can even look at a bunch of other states in the Northeast, places over in the Pacific Northwest. You can see states that are losing population, that are losing business. I saw a headline scrolling through Twitter this morning. Yamaha, which is a major technology manufacturer, they are moving their longtime headquarters from the Silicon Valley in California. They're moving it to Georgia. Right? That is a major loss for the state of California. And as I mentioned a little bit earlier, those decisions are not made lightly. You don't decide to move a multi-billion-dollar global business from one state to another with the flip of a coin. That is a very strategic decision that is made. And they are moving to the state of Georgia with its Republican-led legislature and a Republican governor. That doesn't happen by accident. They didn't pull out a map and throw darts at it and try and figure out where they're going to move their headquarters. They made that decision. It is always better to be on the side of growth than it is on the side of decline. And we are on the side of growth here in North Carolina, and I intend to keep it that way. I'll encourage you, and when you're chatting with your circles, chatting with your coworkers, and political conversations come up, that you encourage individuals to get out. A great comment coming in. Republicans, North Carolina Republicans have a terrible track record during midterm turnout. We have to get people to the polls. Absolutely. And that is what I'm going to be looking at as we go through the remainder of this year is working on that. And I would encourage you to do the same thing as well. Appreciate Andrew Dunn's time. Check him out. His website, his weekly newsletter, longleafpol.com. That's longleafpol.com. You can also follow him over on Twitter at Andrew_Dunn. That's two N's, DUNN, Andrew_Dunn. Well, that's going to do it for a Tuesday edition of the Nick Craig Show. Thanks to the law group here in Wilmington, Melissa Gott and her team, for their continued support. Visit them online, lawgroupnc.com, or give them a call, 910-251-6088. The Nick Craig Show streams live weekday mornings, 7 a.m., YouTube, Rumble, X, Facebook. It's also available 24/7 in your favorite podcast app, and is heard weeknights, 9 to 10 p.m. on WBT Radio in Charlotte. Thanks for joining us. We're back with you tomorrow morning right here